welcome and thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules to be with us today. Before I introduce our four esteemed panelists, allow me just a few minutes to set the stage. Over the past few decades, it has become exceedingly clear that water, as necessary for life, is the most valuable resource. It has also been clear that the world's supply of fresh water is dwindling due to overconsumption, pollution, watershed destruction, and much more. Therefore, with depleting supply and high demand, some have recognized the value of water in terms of high profits for low costs. They see the value of water as a commodity to be exploited for economic gain. Others view water as a human right rather than a commodity. They see that the human body is 70 to 80% water, meaning the privatization of water sources and services means an individual or company owns 70 to 80% of your body. Therefore, in this view, to retain freedom and preserve one's right to water, water resources and services must remain in the public domain. In other words, the value of water in this case is that it is the source of all life. In Laudato Si, Pope Francis states that access to safe drinking water is a basic and universal human right, since it is essential to human survival and, as such, is a condition for the exercise of other human rights. Furthermore, Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew states, "Water is as life-giving and sacred as the blood that runs through our body. It does not belong to any individual or any industry, but is the inviolable and non-negotiable right of every human being." Not only from faith perspectives, but two United Nations resolutions from 2010 and 2015 and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development explicitly recognize a rights-based approach to valuing water and sanitation. On that note, I will turn to our panelists to dive deeper into defining the value of water from a rights-based perspective. Our first panelist is Mira Karunanathan. Mira is an international water campaigner for Blue Planet Project, a global initiative of the Council of Canadians aimed at promoting water justice around the world. The Blue Planet Project works with groups and communities to promote human rights to water and sanitation and to defend water commons. She mobilizes public opposition to privatization of water and bulk water exports while organizing grassroots political movements in many countries. Fearlessly, she led a 2-year global coalition for the human right to water to be named in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Her campaign is lauded as one of the strongest rights-based campaigns during the negotiations for a new Sustainable Development Agenda. Mira was the 2016 recipient of the Women of Courage Award given by Unanima International for displaying courage in her actions in the face of adversity, particularly on her work for the human right to water and sanitation. Mira is pursuing a PhD in geography at the University of Ottawa.
Thank you, Nick. So I thought, I don't actually know how much time we each have.
10 minutes.
10 minutes? I thought I'd start by talking a little bit, our theme today is valuing water and what it means to value water. So I thought I should explain a little bit of the history of the work that many people in this room did together on the human right to water and the campaign to have the human right to water recognized within the SDGs. It actually started when the United Nations was holding these open working group consultations on the Sustainable Development Goals. I'll try not to use acronyms because there are people watching on Facebook and social media. So there were these consultations being held by the United Nations on the Sustainable Development Goals, and one of the goals, SDG 6, is the goal on water, and it was actually Sister Anya from the Sisters of Mercy who had attended a session and realized that the business community was starting to get involved in trying to define SDG 6, the SDG on water. And she immediately called a bunch of us together. She contacted the Blue Planet Project, where I work, contacted my boss, Maud Barlow, and asked if we could help out because she wanted a water justice perspective to dominate the discussion on the SDG on water. And she was very concerned, and she sort of reported to all of us that she was sort of she sounded the alarm on the business community moving in to get involved in defining SDG 6. And I think, we can all be proud in this room. We worked very hard to challenge that. We worked very hard to bring a rights-based perspective to SDG 6. Now, we didn't win every battle, and there's still challenges that we're facing with implementation and the ways in which the indicators and means of implementation are being discussed at the moment. But I think it's important that we realize that we all, recognize that there was a big sort of water justice mobilization around the SDG on water. Now, more recently, what's happened in the last 2 years or so, the World Bank has gotten really involved in the discussion surrounding the implementation of the SDG on water, and that has also raised the red flags for all of us. Because we know that the World Bank is heavily involved in promoting the privatization of water and sanitation services around the world. And the World Bank is also involved in promoting big projects through which communities are losing control over their water resources. And so with the NGO Mining Working Group, the Blue Planet Project also coordinated a big effort to have a big international letter writing campaign asking the Secretary General to step away from this coalition with the World Bank. They created a high-level panel on water, and we asked the UN to step away from that coalition to engage communities in the implementation of the SDG on water, rather than to get the World Bank's advice on the implementation of the SDG on water. Now, the high-level panel released a report. I mean, some of it reflects the criticisms that we brought to those discussions, but one of the things that we were concerned about was this concept of valuing water, and the way in which that report talks about valuing water, and the way in which the World Bank has been talking about valuing water. So, I mean, on the one hand, I think it reflects some of our victories, right? When we talk about, because we've been so effective around the world in fighting the privatization of water and sanitation services, we don't see as much explicit language on the privatization of water and sanitation services. And I'm sure Sandra will talk a little bit more about that. But what we're seeing now is very nice sounding language, and so if you've been to some of the sessions, because I know a few of us have attended some of the sessions on water, it sounds very nice. I mean, they're talking about valuing water. Who can disagree with that, right? But what they mean when they talk about valuing water is they're talking about introducing pricing mechanisms, and they're talking about introducing market-based strategies for valuing water. And through those strategies, communities will lose control over their local water supplies. The reason water is one of the few examples of successes we've had in the last few decades in terms of public control, is because people fight back very hard. Also because governments recognize that having control over water is fundamental, that water has tremendous value to human health, it has tremendous value to environmental well-being, and therefore in most jurisdictions around the world, water is protected as a commons, and governments are involved in the delivery of public water and sanitation services. And where corporations have moved in to take control, there has been a tremendous fight back around the world. So this is, in the area of water and sanitation services in the last 15 years, we've documented more, and this is work that Public Services International has done with other colleagues at the Transnational Institute, but they've documented close to 300 now cases of remunicipalization, and that means people have fought back and communities have taken water back into public hands, right? So this is a tremendous success, and this is why you won't see them explicitly talking about the privatization of water and sanitation services. And in taking control over water, people are taking control over their health, they're taking control over their well-being, and they're taking control over their environment. Now, what the World Bank is trying to do at the moment is support several initiatives to enable corporations to have greater access to water resources. So fresh water supplies, as they become more difficult to obtain for corporations, this is impacting their bottom line, it's impacting their ability to make profits. Climate change is impacting the ability of corporations to have access to water around the world. We're seeing water conflicts in India between Coca-Cola and Pepsi and farmers in the global south. We're also working with communities or community activists in Cape Town who are fighting for access to water in the crisis context there. And so, you know, as water becomes, as we deal with the impacts of climate change, these corporations are seeking strategies to have access to water. So one of the things that the World Bank has done in the last decade or so is that they've established these multi-stakeholder bodies. So they're actually public-private partnerships, but sort of for decision-making, right? And so these corporations, the same corporations that are involved in these water conflicts, like Nestle and Coca-Cola and Pepsi, Dow Chemical, they're Unilever, they're involved in an initiative called the 2030 Water Resources Group, which is a multi-stakeholder coalition brought together by the World Bank to enable these corporations to develop water policies. They're actively involved in South Africa, in India, in Peru, in Mexico. And incidentally, these are the same countries that have been involved in the high-level panel on water at the UN. So these are the same countries who are involved in promoting the same strategies that are promoted in these countries in the global south to give these corporations access to water. So we're seeing some of the same language that is in the policy proposals that this multi-stakeholder body, the 2030 Water Resources Group, and these corporations are promoting in South Africa and Mexico and India. We're seeing these same proposals now emerge in the implementation language for the SDGs. That didn't come out of the consultation process that was set up for the SDGs. It didn't come out of even the intergovernmental process. It actually came out of the World Bank's initiatives with these corporations to facilitate greater access to water. And so when they talk about valuing water, they're talking about establishing mechanisms that would allow these corporations to purchase water, right? So it's about deregulating water, so moving governments out of the way and moving the kind of decision making that would enable public oversight, moving that out of the way, and creating sort of market-based mechanisms, making sure that, you know, you can set up markets so that they can trade water rights in order to access, in order to purchase water. So that's going to impact small farmers. It's already impacting where these systems have been established. Small farmers, it impacts the urban poor, right? So all of the more marginalized communities we're already seeing it in places like Chile, where there isn't a well-established water market, where communities have lost control over water. And so, nonetheless, I think being part of the water justice movement always gives me hope, because I'm constantly seeing solid examples of people fighting back, and we talked about remunicipalization. I know we're going to hear from our comrades in Detroit today about the ways in which they're fighting back. The challenge is big, but people do stand up and fight back. And so this is why it's one of my favorite chants. What do we do when our water is under attack? And we stand up, fight back. So I'm going to say that again. What do we do when our water is under attack?
We stand up and fight back.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mira, for giving us a little bit of the history here at the UN, especially with the 2030 Agenda, and some concrete examples of where privatization has been detrimental throughout the world. Our next speaker is Sister Mary Ellen Howard. She's a native Detroiter, a sister of mercy, and a nurse. She earned her BSN at Mercy College in Detroit and her master's in healthcare management from the University of Wisconsin School of Business at Madison. For 25 years, she served as a healthcare administrator in Mercy hospitals across Michigan, including as CEO in Grayling and Muskegon. From 1995 to 2014, she was the executive director of St. Francis Cabrini Clinic of Most Holy Trinity Church in Detroit, the oldest free medical clinic for uninsured persons in the nation. Since retiring, Mary Ellen is an active advocate on the local, state, and national levels for public health issues, focusing on the human right to safe, affordable public water for all.
Good afternoon. Got a little competition out there. I hope you can hear me. I'm from Michigan, a peninsula surrounded by the Great Lakes, which holds 21% of the world's fresh surface water. But in spite of this, many of the people in my state are without water. And how could this be when we have such an abundance of water and yet people can't get it? I want to tell a tale of two cities. Flint and Detroit. In the past decade, Michigan's Governor Snyder declared both cities to be in a state of financial emergency. He appointed emergency managers with unlimited power to run the city and return them to solvency. Both Flint and Detroit have been devastated by deindustrialization and disinvestment. Both have majority African American populations with high unemployment and poverty rates. You may have heard about the poisoning of Flint's water, which received international media attention. For many years, Flint had purchased its water from Detroit, but Flint's emergency manager decided that Detroit was charging too much, so he put Flint water system back online, switching the water source from Lake Huron to the notorious Flint River. Corrosion control chemicals to treat the water, which would have cost $150 a day, were not used, and the pipes began to leach lead into Flint's water. The citizens complained that the water was brown and orange, filled with particles, frothy, and foul-smelling. They complained of health problems related to the water. Their hair was falling out and there were red welts on their skin. Plants and pets were dying. A pediatrician saw child lead levels were rising at an alarming rate, and she blew the whistle. There was also an outbreak of Legionella disease related to the water, and 12 people died. Meanwhile, the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality and the emergency manager told the people of Flint for 18 months that there was no problem with the water. It was perfectly safe to drink. Community organizers refused to believe them, however, and did their own testing of the water. Finally, the people prevailed, and the water was again hooked up to Detroit. A month ago, Governor Snyder told Flint that the water is now safe and that the state will no longer provide them with free bottled water. But the people have lost all trust in government and continue to use the bottled water. Needless to say, all this has been a terrible blow to Flint, which was a city already struggling. The second city, Detroit, is my hometown, and it's another story. In 2013, Governor Snyder appointed an emergency manager to Detroit also, who was a bankruptcy lawyer. He soon filed the largest municipal bankruptcy in the United States history, with Detroit's debt estimated at $20 billion. One of the city's biggest assets was the Detroit Water and Sewerage Department, serving 127 cities. It's one of the largest water departments in the United States. To settle the bankruptcy, the emergency manager considered selling the Detroit water system to satisfy the debts of the city. He ordered that all water bills that were over $150 and 2 months overdue to be paid immediately. And he ordered water shut off to 150,000 homes. 150,000 residences had their water shut off. And each residence has, two to three people living in it at least. And poor people tend to have more people living in the home. So it's really a disaster. Shut-offs were done, often without notice, and regardless of whether there were babies, elders, disabled in the home. Meanwhile, overdue corporate accounts were not made to pay, nor were they shut off. Bills more than 6 months overdue were transferred to the homeowner's property bill, which resulted in thousands losing their homes. Further, in those homes where children are present, parents can be judged unfit if there's no water in the home, and protective services will remove the children and place them in foster care. So overall, it's a disaster. In contrast, to the citizens of Flint who were seen as victims, the citizens of Detroit were portrayed as slackers who just needed to pay their water bills. The problem is that 67% of Detroiters do not have income sufficient to meet their basic needs, and the water rates in Detroit are some of the highest in the nation. To address this issue of water affordability, the People's Water Board, a grassroots advocacy group to which I belong, proposed that Detroit adopt a water affordability plan. Under this plan, if your household income is below poverty level, your water bill would be no more than 3% of your income. Other cities in the United States have adopted water affordability plans, but Detroit's Mayor Duggan refuses. In the end, the Detroit Water and Sewerage Department was not sold, but tens of thousands of households had their water turned off, some for a couple of years. Since then, every spring when the ground thaws, the DWSD announces how many households will have their water shut off because bills are overdue. This April, they announced that there would be 17,000 households shut off this summer. I don't know how those families are surviving without water. One day, Detroit's water crisis literally came knocking at my front door. I live in a poor neighborhood on the east side of Detroit. One day, one of our neighbors came to our door to tell us that his water had been shut off, and to ask if he could take water from the side of our house from the tap for his family of 4. He had just lost his job and had not yet found another job. His wife was disabled with a serious heart condition, and they had 2 high school children. For a year and a half, he and the children carried water buckets from our house to their house. Once a week, they dropped their laundry off, and we washed their clothes for them. I don't know how they survived. In 2014, the Detroit People's Water Board invited the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the human right to water and sanitation to visit Detroit and to investigate the human rights violations related to water. Katerina d'Albuquerque visited homes where the water had been shut off. At a town hall meeting, she listened to the victims of the water shutoffs tell their stories. At the end of her visit, she presented her findings to the mayor of Detroit, Mike Duggan. He was incensed that the United Nations thought they could come into his city and tell him what he ought to be doing. He still refuses to consider a water affordability plan for Detroit. So what's wrong with this picture? It's pretty discouraging. Here are my conclusions. Number 1, water is essential for life. Every person needs water every single day. There is no alternative to water, and water cannot be produced. That's why corporations want to control it, want power over water. Water is a commons which must be held in trust by the government for the people. It should never be privatized, monetized, or commodified for corporate profit. I keep hearing the phrase, our politicians continually, at least in Michigan, use the phrase public-private partnerships, which seem to be their solution to everything. But it's really code for privatization. And we have to be aware of that, of the public-private partnerships. Groundwater must also be protected. Corporations like Nestle's are buying up land to get at the groundwater, which often is not as regulated as surface water. I heard a new term recently. It's called climate gentrification. What's happening right now is that developers are becoming less interested in acquiring property in coastal states, and they're favoring states like Michigan because it has fresh, abundant water
and has less threat from the effects of globalization. So these very expensive shoreline properties all of a sudden aren't as desirable, and in fact they're looking more inward, inland. The corporate land grab in Detroit is an example of climate gentrification. Water must be conserved. We cannot afford to take water for granted. Every drop is precious. Water must be affordable. Researchers at Michigan State University project that by 2020, 35% of the households in the United States will not be able to afford their water bills. 35%, that is. Affordable water ensures that even low-income households can pay their bills, maintain their dignity, have water, and keep their homes and families intact. Water is not recognized as a human right in the United States. In fact, water injustice, like shutoffs, has become the norm and is seen as acceptable. That really hurts me. It makes me angry and sad, but it's true. Corporate threats to the world's water are growing. What are we doing about it? We must prevent water privatization and ensure water affordability. And how will we do this? From my work in Detroit, one thing is clear to me. Self-sufficiency will not work. We will do this together, or we will do it not at all. Grassroots groups, like the Detroit People's Water Board, are most effective in mobilizing people to bring light to the problem and to demand solutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Sister Mary Ellen, for giving us your tale of two cities, Detroit and Flint, and for illuminating that when we talk about the human right to water and sanitation, we're talking about keeping water owned by the public, in the public hands, but also affordability mechanisms so that people at every income level can have access, which is often a common mistake. A lot of people, when you say the human right to water and sanitation, the accusation is, oh, you're demanding that water be given away for free. But oftentimes it's just looking for an affordability mechanism for people to access it, as there are often costs involved. Our next speaker is Maureen Taylor. Maureen Taylor has served as state chair of the Michigan Welfare Rights Organization since 1993 and was elected treasurer of the National Welfare Rights Union in 1994. Ms. Taylor is a dedicated community activist who represents public assistance recipients at Michigan Department of Health and Human Services offices over case disputes. Along with other welfare rights members, she conducts local and state DHS policy trainings and works with elected officials and program administrators to draft policies and procedures that protect poor and low-income families. Since 2002, the Michigan Welfare Rights Organization has worked with thousands of concerned residents and organizations to stop water, gas, and electricity shutoffs for thousands of low-income households in Detroit. She has testified before Detroit City Council in Michigan State Capitol and before members of Congress and federal administrations on the plight of poor people, especially as safety net programs are removed without education or employment opportunities for low-income families.
All right. What Nick has just read, it makes me feel tired. Because it looks like we've been busy for about 150 years, and sometimes it feels that way. My name is Maureen Taylor. I serve as state chairperson of the Michigan Welfare Rights Organization, and I bring you greetings from Michigan Welfare Rights. We are the organization that fights for the rights of low-income people. I'm here today with my national chairperson. I try to get her to go places, and so we can continue to run these, to talk about the same information over and over again. And that is, it appears as if rich people don't have enough money and poor people have too much. And everywhere we go, this seems to be the case. Now, I want to do a little bit of a different kind of a presentation because, see, I'm sure everybody in this room has heard about Detroit and what's wrong there. And you can see by the way I look, we're fly. This is the way we roll all the time. We look like this, we walk like this, we think like this. This is who we are, all right? In the early days of the United States of America, Jim Crow, terrible violence, terrible poverty, there were many, many people, African Americans, Hispanics, Native Americans, poor whites, that left the Jim Crow South. And it was a group that went to the west, and they ended up in Sacramento and San Francisco and whatnot. Another group went to the east, New York, Harlem, these kind of places. And then there was the group that came up the Middle Passage. And so these are the folks that went to Flint, they came to Pontiac, they came to Chicago, came to Detroit, came to those places in the middle. But they didn't come just because of running away. Folks showed up because Henry Ford put a sign out and said, we will pay you to work on something called an assembly line if you come here. Brilliant, brilliant marketing tactic. And people by the millions began to show up in places like Huber Avenue Foundry, Lynch Road Assembly, Mack Stamping, Cadillac Fleetwood, Cadillac Glass, Chevrolet Gear and Axle, Dodge Main, and my favorite, the Rouge plant, which is in a little suburban area right outside of Detroit called Dearborn. At its height, the Dearborn complex, and if you don't know anything about cars, let me give you the scientific explanation of a complex. You mix some steel and dirt and something else in this pot. Then you move it over here and you heat it up. Then you move it over here and you cool it off. Then you put it over here and you shake it up. And then it turns into parts. And so now you have an engine plant, you have a transmission plant, you have a body shop, you have whatever the next thing is, and it started over here with dirt, and at the end it rolls off and it becomes a car. Now you've got the scientific explanation of how this works, right? So that's what we did. Now at the Ford Rouge assembly plant, all of these different components, and at its height it had just over 100,000 workers scattered in these different places. Today, they have 9,000 or fewer workers, and they make 8 times as many cars. What happened was something called R2-D2, CPO-3. Computers showed up, and the computer has a little dot like this, and it put it into the mechanism, and now that computer can do what 50 people used to do. My son works at the Ford Rouge plant, and he's a skilled high-low driver. And he has replaced about 200 people at his job. So I don't want folks to just think that all of a sudden Detroit became crazy. We didn't become crazy. We had up to 2 million people that lived in my beloved city. Up to 2 million. We had everything. We didn't need anybody else. We didn't want to come to New York and visit you guys. We weren't interested in going to California where people eat tofu. We didn't have an interest in that. Everybody came to Detroit because we had what was going on. When you reduce from 2 million people, and every time you close a plant, you don't open it back up again, and now we have just under 700,000. So more than 1 million people walked away from just Detroit. And here comes the conversation about bankruptcy. In the next 20, 30, 40 years, you guys are going to be bankrupt. So why don't we just cause the pain right now? And we'll just tax you and tax you, but we won't call it a tax. What we'll call it is we'll take the pensions away from your firefighters and from your police officers. And what we will do is to make certain the health care that retirees depended on, we're going to take that away too. All of these things happen. And this is supposed to be a democracy in the United States of America. And I'm sure you've heard that rumor before, but that's not what happened. They came in the middle of the night. I wasn't a factory worker, so I didn't say anything. I wasn't a skilled trades worker, so I didn't say anything. I wasn't whatever the other list was, I didn't say anything until one day there was nobody left there to help me. And that's the story. We get all of that and we bring it down to this question of water. How is it? And I've talked to some of my colleagues here today. I have the same question all the time. What kind of place is this we live? Where folks who are disabled, people who are elderly, individuals that have children in the house and they're all living on a fixed income, and veterans, what kind of place is this we live? Where people say we have the right to punish you because I'm a member of the government. You didn't pay your water bill, so I can torture you, knowing that without water, your life is at risk. We have a hepatitis activity that's breaking out all over Detroit. We can't get the water department to act right, but we can't get the health department to label what's going on. We don't know why people have Legionnaire's disease. We don't know why people are not able to wash their hands. We don't know what kind of place is this? And it's not just germane to Detroit. We're talking about somebody that took a hose away from clean spigots and put it in the Flint River where there was a cat rolling by, a tire, all manners of filth, and it was okay for months for people to drink that. What kind of place is this I live in? I don't understand this, and I continue to raise these arguments. A water affordability plan is the most immediate and quickest thing to do. We all of us that are in the Detroit area, in the Highland Park area, throughout Michigan, we fight this stupid fight every day. And I call it a stupid fight. What kind of people are we? I was little when my parents took me all the way to California, and I saw at the, what's it called, the Walt Disney Land, they were already purifying salt water. That was years ago. The answer to our issues is that we have to start to call the issue what it is. We're talking about undeniable greed. We're talking about clergy. We're talking about, we're talking about clergy and people of the religious order that stand mute. And when you stand mute, you are a contributor to the problem. I don't understand, and we had to get the United Nations to come into the city of Detroit and have a conversation about the immorality as well as the political divisiveness of cutting water off. And we had a mayor that insulted these two international women. Why are these two white women coming to Detroit to tell us what we should do? Horrified. But that's part of the problem. American exceptionalism. We don't have poor people in America. That's not true. We don't have hungry people in America. That's not true. We don't have people in America that don't have water because they can't pay for it. That's not true. We don't have people in America, Native Americans, that are living in trailer homes with no water. That is true. It's an outrage, and I stay mad at this circumstance. We talk about the value of water. I don't know what the value of water is, because it seems to me that people don't even have value anymore. Where I live, if you have a dog, and that dog is on your front porch, and the children walk by, and you have not given that dog water 2 or 3 days, the Boy Scouts are going to be called, the Girl Scouts are going to be called, somebody's going to get ISIS on the telephone, everybody's going to be called to punish anybody that won't give a dog water. But the same situation does not occur with water. I don't understand this. And maybe like Sister Mary Ellen says, it's a bigger picture than me. I do know that with the rise of technology that used to enhance labor, technology now exploits labor and reduces labor to nothing. And when you don't matter anymore, when it's not important anymore that you live, you don't need water, you don't need housing, you don't need an education. You can just exist until you don't exist anymore. I bring you greetings from Michigan Welfare Rights. Come to Detroit, Michigan, Highland Park, or any of the places that we live, and you'd be very welcome. And if we can't provide water for you, we'll do the next best thing. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Maureen, for giving us a glimpse into the Detroit system and illuminating us and how this is not only a systemic issue within our governments and politics, but it's also an issue of values, a spiritual issue where we are losing our value of others and other humans and all of this type of thing. Our next speaker is Sandra Vermooten. Sandra is the head of campaigns of Public Services International, a global trade union federation that brings together more than 20 million workers represented by over 700 unions in 163 countries and territories. PSI is dedicated to promoting quality public services in every part of the world. Their members, 2/3 of whom are women, work in social services, healthcare, municipal and community services, central government, and public utilities such as water and electricity. Sandra has worked with the ILO, the ITUC since 1998, before joining PSI in 2012. She has been involved in the negotiations of a 2030 agenda, financing for development, and leads campaigns on privatization, trade unions' rights, and equality issues. In 2016, she worked with COMHEG Commissioner and PSI General Secretary Rosa Pavanelli on the UN High-Level Commission on Employment in Health and Economic Growth. Originally from Antwerp, Belgium, Sandra speaks 6 languages fluently and has a degree in international law and an MA in economic and social policy reform.
Hello everybody, and I'm really pleased to be here, even though we're not many. I think just listening to the both of you speak, I mean, I think there is no denying about the importance of carrying an alternative voice and an opinion from the ground on what is really happening to people's lives when water is privatized and when the human right to water is denied. And I was crying actually. Well, it's not the first time I hear this story, obviously, because we have affiliates here in the United States, AFT, AFSME, AFG, the Teamsters that are, of course, very much involved also in the fight against privatization and supporting the campaigns in Flint and in Detroit. But yeah, it's not just a disaster. It's really a horror story. And the thing is that I guess what these stories brought home is that this is not something that happens in developing countries, where because of a lack of investment in infrastructure for decades, now a vast majority of urban populations in cities like Lagos, but also in South Africa, have no access to running water, whereas that was the case, you know, several decades back. There was a larger coverage actually in some of the urban areas. So the fact that this is now happening both in developed and developing nations is, of course, extremely distressing. Nicolas already told you about what PSI is, and we work with our affiliate members, with trade unions, specifically on the human right to water, those that are working within water and sanitation services, but also public service workers at large, and build coalitions with civil society organizations at the global level, developing research, supporting campaigns at local but also global level, challenging the policies of the World Bank and the IMF that Mira was talking about, and trying to come up with I would say an alternative discourse, an alternative strategy, and also a funding, public finance strategy to avoid what we just heard, and also really try to look at what the obligations are of governments, but also how we can make public services work better, ensuring that there is less water lost, but also less, say, hay on the to give this opportunity to our opponents to raise the argument that the private is always better. You were talking about, you know, these white women being divisive. You know, that is exactly what I was told last week here at the United Nations by a private water operator in a meeting, a partnership exchange, you know, where private operators come together to exchange experiences. So when we speak about public-private partnerships not delivering on their promises, on public-private partnerships being more expensive in the end for the public than water being operated by through public companies, or the fact that PPPs do not allow for the package, let's say the service package, to be adapted to the necessities, to the needs of local populations, or the fact that vulnerable groups are being left behind, excluded, etc., etc., and that there are very often no negotiation on tariffs, as what you've just said. When we say that, I'm told that I'm being divisive, that I'm being ideological, that I'm, that when we ask for an open dialogue, where we can actually bring the evidence to the fore, and really talk about whether these policy options are really the right tools to achieve sustainable development. There is not a lot of appetite, let's say, on the other side. But I think the call for this open dialogue is becoming stronger and stronger. And I think that I hope that at next year's HLPF that we will either have that dialogue within the United Nations or outside, because meetings behind closed doors with peoples of the PPP unit of the World Bank that we have achieved, to have, because we've been raising, I would say, globally our voice on the fact that these models don't work. In the end, after having 2-day meetings, the only thing they can tell us is that they believe, notwithstanding all of the evidence that we would bring, that they believe that their models can work. When we come with this amount of evidence and they have 8 examples of places where it did actually work out with very strong regulatory framework, I mean, that's, how can you take that seriously? I mean, so when we here talk about policies needing to be evidence-based, when your counterpart is basically using arguments of economic fundamentalism, because that's what it is. I think we really need a reset. We need a reality check, and we really need to go back, I think, to basics, and maybe send these people back to university to learn about economics. What we see is that this is sabotage. Huh? This is sabotage. This is sabotage.
That's Fiolio.
Exactly. So on the one hand, we see that we have all this evidence that privatization of water has been detrimental, and that corporations tend to use monopoly power to generate excessive profits. At the same time, we also see that private investors have largely ignored the most underserved regions of the world, while favoring more lucrative markets requiring less capital and promising greater returns. That has actually generated a massive backlash. I mean, the backlash meaning remunicipalization, the remunicipalization of the water facility in Paris, which is the home of Veolia and EDF, the largest multinationals pushing for privatization of water, that in their hometown, water was remunicipalized. I think it's quite telling. And because of the fact that the World Bank wants to support companies that want to enter these, less attractive markets, we see policies such as the cascade policy, where any type of investment is favored. For any type of investment need, the private sector is favored. And so the World Bank has a policy now that actually, when companies need extra incentives to go into a market, they provide extremely cheap loans. They look at how the regulatory framework should be adapted to the needs of the investor. And I mean, it's just a very wide array of measures that basically take away that favor the private sector in such a way which goes against the public interest. And I think that's that is exactly what we've been talking about here. And this is something that we obviously that we criticize, and that's a policy that needs to be reformed urgently. I said, yeah, we look at how we can, but at the same time, you know, we don't want to always come across as saying that, you know, everything is, you know, PPPs are bad. It's a very one-sided story, a very one-sided storyline, a storyline that we're being pushed in by being given 2 minutes for our interventions. Yeah. You know, when on the one hand there's such an avalanche, I would say, of this PPP you know, scenario, we cannot do other ways, and then we cannot do say anything else. And of course, coming up with counter arguments. Well, we really have to look at all the other aspects, all the other things I think that we need to make the access to water really a human right. And that's of course improving public services, really doing capacity building of public water operators, creating public-public partnerships, you know, that look at capacity building. And when you look at what the UN, there was a person there last week from, what's it called, GOAPS, the public water, Ijiwapa, yes. I mean, the man was almost apologetic. I really felt for him, you know. But this is really the way forward, and unfortunately, that institution is also not getting the necessary recognition nor funding within the UN system. So we also have to support, I think, those that are doing the good work and that are within the system, that are you know, carrying our message, and I think fighting for the public interest. We also have to recognize that at the moment, 90% of water sanitation systems are still public. You know, so this is also very much a story about defending those and looking at what we need to be able to keep on funding those. So, I mean, PSI is very much involved in campaigning for tax justice and against privatization as a whole. You know, fighting the neoliberal mantra and the greed for greed that is unfortunately so widespread. We look at the relation between we look at, you know, coalition building outside of these already existing coalitions with people who are fighting for a green economy. You know, if you go to Africa now, what is the consequence of people not having access to public water? It's plastic bags everywhere. I mean, plastic bags, plastic bottles. Every single home, you open the fridge, is filled with half-liter water bottles. You know, we need to build public awareness on by leading by example, and you know, our affiliates are now adopting a policy. You know, that at least in their meetings they use these big water bottles when there is no running water. You know, by making small changes in our everyday lives, trying to, I think, to make a change. Blah blah blah. Yes. I think the work we've been doing on remunicipalization, it revolves around stopping privatization from happening and taking back public control of public-private partnerships when they end. So involving communities, working with trade unions in those places where we see that privatization has failed. And that is happening not just in the West, but also in countries, you know, in the global South. So I think that we are making progress on that, but we need to do much more, because the privatization mantra, unfortunately, is very well funded. You know, in terms of the media, I think we really have to carry our message, and I welcome the very strong participation of faith-based organizations and also of the Pope in terms of you know, really trying to carry this message forward. I mean, if anybody, I mean, that is definitely a very welcome contribution to these campaigns. So just to finish, I want to tell you about a meeting that I attended yesterday, which was called an SDG lab on resource mobilization. Kate Donald was there as well, and we thought that this was going to be a meeting about mobilizing resources for sustainable development so that we can implement, you know, all these basic human rights. But instead, it was actually a promo meeting for investment groups that are interested in turning the HLPF into an investment forum. It was quite telling that the people looking for investments were all from the global south, and the people from the investment funds were from the global north. And we were trying to, you know, do this, I don't know, this kind of promo talk of all the regulation that they would adopt to accommodate, you know, investments in their infrastructure at any cost. And the person from the minister from Ethiopia who was there talked about, you know, all those wonderful tax-free zones that they just opened, where I had to tell him about the fact that yes, those tax-free zones are the working conditions there for textile companies such as H&M and other large retailers are considerably better than in other, for example, in Bangladesh, but wages are under $1 a day, under $1 a day. So countries are negotiating, are basically going the race to the bottom. They're already giving tax holidays, so the companies are not paying taxes. So the only thing they can still negotiate with is really is the salaries of these wage workers, and with the argument that, you know, one day, you know, the most important now is to bring jobs to these people, and then, you know, one day they will be entitled to a decent wage. But the people who are the shareholders of these companies that are already filthy rich, they're making their profits right now. They're making their profits right now, and so these investments are not going to contribute to better public provision of water, of sanitation, of health, of education, to none of those people there. And I really think that we have to keep that in mind and link all these fights together. You know, it makes so much sense to anybody that, you know, that you need to have access to water and a living wage to be able for people to move forward and really create sustainable development. But unfortunately, that message, we still need to bring it home, including at the United Nations. So I count on all of us to do exactly that. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator, for talking to us about the detrimental impacts of PPPs, but not stopping there and saying how we need to be looking for creative solutions and promoting creative solutions in place of those models.
I'm sorry, I actually skipped over a section in my notes, and I won't go over it again, but just to say, you know, because we were asked to talk about the human right to water and why the human right to water in the SDGs as a way, you know, within the context of valuing water and what the relationship is, and really, you know, we have been heard, as I mentioned, and the human right to water has been recognized, but when we see the way it's talked about, it's sort of reduced to narrow indicators, and we need to force governments to look more broadly. So they talk about enabling conditions for private investments. We should talk about enabling conditions for the implementation of the human right to water and sanitation. Yeah. And one of the biggest enabling conditions is public investment in our infrastructure. That without public investment in our water and sanitation infrastructure, we're not going to have implementation of the human right to water and sanitation. We're not going to have water and sanitation for all, as SDG 6 claims it would. So, and then the other, I mean, so we actually, with PSI, we've just launched this report which talks about that we need the human rights frameworks that we have pushed for to look at macroeconomic policy issues, that to value water is to invest in public water and sanitation services. To value water is to not sign on to trade agreements that would allow corporations to sue our governments when they bring in public policies that protect water resources and protect people's rights to water. And so we have more on that in that report, so we encourage you all to read it. It's on the Public Services International website as well as the Blue Planet Project website.